Well, students, here we are on Friday of our lecture series on culture. And I want to kind of continue where we had left off on Wednesday and talk about today. You have to forgive me, I just lost my place. Give me half a second. Okay. Don't you hate when that happens? We're going to talk about, on page 440, we're talking about adapting to a new culture. I'll adjust the camera a little bit. That's better. Okay, so when someone becomes socialized, that means coming into the new culture, being in a new culture does create, just think of when you went for your job for the first time, any job, or going from one job to another. It isn't just a skill set that you walk in there, but it does create, as your book says, a lot of uncertainty, stress, and anxiety. And over time, individuals try to adapt to the new culture. And when they leave that culture, they continue to experience a lot of stresses that are associated with the culture itself. So your book calls it the process of adaptation. That means whether you're working in an international company or a national company, accepting the new culture is something that the person going into that culture um, needs to get involved with, like developing the norms with the already existing norms that are in that culture. When they get hired, they start to work. And usually individuals can adapt in a lot of different ways. So when we talk about adaptation, all right, the next thing is linking the page 441, linking the organizational culture and strategy. So the strategy is something that is usually etched in stone in the planning process. So now we have the task to evaluate the culture. I remember the book that they're talking about here, I read it, In Search of Excellence by Tom Peters and Robert Waterman. And they argued that organizational culture was directly linked to the organization's strategies. And certain cultures, that's companies that are essentially successful, all right, are those that have a culture that feeds into the employees as well as the employees feeding into the culture. And I remember that when I read this book, now it's coming back to me, they talked about GM, General Motors. And what the book really focused on was Japanese management practices on, for example, companies like Toyota that fostered innovation and productivity. But the Japanese really predicated their businesses on loyalty and hard work. They were not stigmatized by innovation. They were allowed to use that creativity and then put it into their productivity. If they had a good idea, they were respected for it. And the culture was that if you worked hard enough, you could really make it in the Japanese business. But they rewarded loyalty and people that went to work every day and In Search of Excellence was one of the best books out there. And then I also read this one too, Good to Great by Jim Collins. And if you haven't read these books, if you have a chance to, you probably download them right now as you're talking to me. I mean, as you're listening to me online, they're really worth the read, especially where a lot of us now are kind of quarantined, right? Until this epidemic goes down. But the point I'm trying to make is that um, Good to Great talked about organizational culture, strategy, and success. So I really recommend you reading those two books if you can. But Mintzberg, Henry Mintzberg, which is, we probably talked about this in your freshman year. He was a professor and a consultant. And what he did is he developed a model that links culture to strategy. So he went into a little bit more into the subcultures, which we talked about. And what he said was, when a single subculture predominates, the subculture begins to influence the organization's overall strategy. Now that's really interesting, isn't it? So the entrepreneurial culture predominates in the startups and the new ventures. Why? Because strong vision and direction are needed, as the book states, but the dominant cultural force directs the future of the organization. For example, if marketing is a subculture of an organization, turns around and says to production, I need you to stop what you're doing, get this prototype up, so it's a new innovative product, and it's going to bring a lot of profit into the company. Well, does production just do same old, status quo, or do they stop and they make the prototype? Because here again, they're thinking futuristically. Then we go to the machine culture, and that predominates in a lot of manufacturing organizations. And remember, too, a lot of our manufacturing is done overseas, and that manufacturing has a lot of technology induced into it, which they have come up with standardized practice, but they also contain costs in producing materials and products. Then we've got the proficiency culture, and that relies on knowledge, skills, and training. And we really need this now, especially during this pandemic. These apply to hospitals and professional service firms. The concentration culture, that values the ability to serve public markets. And this talks a lot about diversity in consumer markets for things that we like right now with this pandemic. We need a lot. I mentioned this before, I know, but we need a lot of things like masks, sanitizers, things like that. So certain cultures have to concentrate on those particular products that have the ability to produce them. Why? To save lives. Now, then we go to the innovation culture, new ways of doing things. That's where we talked about the Japanese. Um, they've come up with wonderful ways to manufacture automobiles with a lot of technology, and Korea as well, coming up with the Hyundai. Then we have the cooperation culture that looks at ideologies, strong values, and norms. I know we've already discussed this, but I want to reinforce it because these 7 things are important. And then the competition culture looks at a culture that talks about and influenced by politics. There's no central direction and there's no compromising. I'm not going there. So basically, conclusively in this section, we have a better understanding of culture. And it's achieved by examining the dimensions of culture, as your book states. But the most important thing is, how do we differentiate between organization, national, and international culture? What is the purpose of culture, and how much does it influence an organization? And as we know, cultures serve so many important different functions. And I think you can go back and look at some of the questions which are in the end of this section and reflect on that for a bit. What are some of the advantages of a strong company culture? I'm on page 444, by the way, after conclusion. What might be some disadvantages? Why do you think this? And how might you apply this research to an organization that you know of or work for? Okay, this is the end of my lectures for the week. And I want you to go back, check your DQs, and really think about, reflect long and hard on this particular section, because you can have all the skill sets in the world. If you don't get into a culture that agrees with those skill sets, and you don't adapt, no matter how much money you want to make, how much you want that job, it's going to be miserable. Because when you're putting all these hours in, you know you make a difference. It's really worth fitting into the culture and understanding, maybe if you're a leader, if you get hired as a supervisor or you work yourself up to one, how you can improve that organization. Have a great weekend.